Welcome to our live Q&A with Sky's defence and security analyst Michael Clarke, where we're going to be answering questions submitted by readers of our Ukraine blog. We'll also be answering questions submitted on YouTube as we go. So if you scan the QR code, you should be able to see on your screen. We'll see those questions and we'll try to get round to them. Now, the backdrop, of course, to all of this is the US negotiations with Trump. US negotiations initiated by Trump, with Russia, with or without Ukraine's say so, certainly without their presence so far. We've had hundreds of questions in already, so let's just get straight into it with Michael. The first is from Jeff, and he's saying, as Putin will not allow NATO troops to be in Ukraine, how would any peacekeeping force be made up? And he's suggesting perhaps could there be apparently neutral nations, perhaps the Chinese, whether they're neutral or not is another question, but what will that look like?
It would depend, Tom, entirely on the rubric of the peacekeeping. I mean, what sort of peace are we talking about? I mean, we've no idea what the mission would be. And so Zelensky's talked about, well, we need 110,000 troops to man the whole of the border, which is 1,000 kilometres long. And as you and I have talked about before, if you're going to have 110,000 troops, you need 330,000 troops set aside for this, because for every group you've got in Ukraine, you need another group training to go in, another group that's just come out that needs some rest and then retraining for something else. So it would depend. I mean, if European troops are not involved, conceivably, I mean, UN peacekeepers come in all shapes and sizes. A lot of Latin American countries offer troops. Countries like Indonesia have quite big armies. The Indians have quite a large army. China has an enormous army, if they would be acceptable. It would be possible to get lots of troops there if countries were prepared to do it. But I'm not sure at the moment anyone would be putting their hands up to this, because they don't know what the mission will be. And we won't know that for maybe quite some time.
Also, if you think of a peacekeeping force, it's usually a big power between two smaller nations. And actually, any peacekeeping force, if it's 110,000, you're between two huge armies here. You're right in the firing line.
Yes, I mean, none of the specialists that I speak to about this thinks that this is going to be a stable peacekeeping line, that whoever goes in there, if somebody goes in to separate the participants, is going to have a very edgy time. And it is likely there will be events, I mean, not necessarily always initiated by the Russians. It might be that the Ukrainians would see an opportunity of grabbing back a bit of territory or provoking the Russians to attack in order to get some sort of response. I mean, both sides would have to be watched very carefully, even though the Russians are clearly the aggressors in this particular case. So I think, we're still a long way from being able to put on paper any peacekeeping operation that might look feasible. I spent some time a couple of nights ago with two very senior generals, one American and one British general, and we went through everything we could think of, every idea that's come up, asking each other, will this work, will that work, what do you think? And we went round in a circle, we could not come up with a single idea that obviously recommended itself. Every idea seemed to have a fatal flaw in it somewhere.
Well, that's interesting, because actually that brings us on to the next question, which is from Kieran, and talking about this idea of what if there isn't a deal? So if the US, does withdraw all military assistance, it's not outside the realms of possibility, to put it mildly, and you don't get a deal. Kieran asks, do you think Russia could push for an all-out victory this summer to coincide with the materiel crisis on the Ukrainian side?
I don't think the Russians can get an all-out victory. If the Ukrainians keep on fighting, I don't know if they should or they could, but they can certainly last out for a while yet. I mean, their American supplies will last for a few months yet, and they're getting more supplies that have been promised from European partners. So the Ukrainians could keep on fighting. I mean, you can ask yourself, is that strategically sensible from their point of view? But they could keep going. The Russians have not been capable of making a breakthrough. Interestingly, the Russians do not practice maneuver warfare. All their doctrine, if you read their stuff, it's all about maneuver warfare, moving quickly, hitting decisively. What they've done in Ukraine is the exact opposite, because they can't do what they practiced. And they've lost the army. They've used up their professional army. The army they've got in Ukraine is a completely new army of conscripts and new contract soldiers who've come into the business just for this operation. And they're now behaving in a way that's completely at variance with their doctrine. And so they're grinding forward. And I don't see any prospect, if the Ukrainians try to stop them, of the Russians being able to make a big breakthrough. They could grab more territory if they keep on fighting for another 6 months. Maybe they'll get the whole of the Donbass. But that, could they get through to to Dnipro? Could they really get through to Odessa? I doubt it.
I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that was the fear, wasn't it, back in even late last year, that there could be a Russian breakthrough, that Ukraine was really hanging on, about to run out.
That's right.
Those weapons did arrive, though, and that seems to have helped. And I suppose the other flip side of that is, in terms of Ukrainian victory, could Ukraine fight on? If the US does withdraw military assistance, how could it fight on?
Well, yes, they could. I mean, technically they could for some months, maybe for the rest of the year. And they would be, again, they'd probably be losing slowly. So, they would probably lose, I would guess if they carry on, they'll certainly probably lose Pokrovsk, I would guess. They'd lose more areas in the Donbass. And ultimately, the two places in the Donbass that really matter are Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. If they lose them, then they've basically lost the Donbass. And if the Russians keep on grinding away and the Ukrainians keep on making them pay a very heavy price for every square meter they take, which they do, but eventually, if this thing went on, say, for the rest of the year, one would expect the Russians probably to get the whole of the Donbass. But I would guess, I'm obviously guessing, but I would guess that that's the best that the Russians could expect if they keep fighting. Not breaking through to the west of the country, being able to really move across the whole of the coastal strip. I don't think they can do that.
And that was, initially what everyone expected to happen, wasn't it? As those columns were rolling in on Kyiv. Russia,
and they made a mess of it to start with. And we saw that. They made a terrible mess of it in the first couple of weeks. And we all said, us, professionals in the analysis business, they said, look, they'll learn. All armies learn. They'll get better at it. And they did get better at it. But they didn't get better at it sufficiently well to get their tactics right. And so their tactics have remained these frontal assault tactics, very expensive, almost human wave tactics. And although they've got some things right, it's this ability to just keep grinding on, keep feeding men into the machine. They're losing 1,500 soldiers a day, and they're only recruiting, even with very high rates of pay, they're only recruiting about 800 to 1,000 troops a day. So they're losing more troops on the battlefield than they can recruit, even in the areas of eastern Russia and from foreign countries.
So in that sense, a break would be welcome for Putin as well, in terms of, restocking, rearming, re-equipping that army. And so Jason is asking that, actually, saying if Putin uses a peace agreement to get his military back into shape, which countries might be most vulnerable in future? And that's really interesting because, we've seen which countries have spent most on the Ukrainian war. Ed Conway had great analysis on that. In terms of GDP, it's all the countries that border Russia. It's also why Poland's very reluctant to be part of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, because it wants those troops to defend Poland quite fairly. So, to Jason's question, which countries would be most worried if there is this peace deal and they think they might be in Putin's sights?
The countries that are most vulnerable are kind of in order of vulnerability, probably. Moldova is very vulnerable because there's already a breakaway republic has existed for years in Transnistria, a Russian-speaking republic, and the Russians have had troops illegally in Transnistria for many, many years now. And Moldova, the Russians assumed would fall as they took the whole of Ukraine. Moldova would just come over and they'd grab that as well because it's part of the old empire which they're trying to reestablish. If the government in Georgia, the pro-Russian government, which is they're now on 91 days of street protests against them, democracy protesters. If it looks as if the democracy protesters might actually put the Georgia Dream government in danger, I think the Russians would just move in and take control of Georgia. Then the other vulnerable areas, as far as NATO is concerned, are, as you mentioned, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Estonia and Latvia have both got big Russian minorities, and it wouldn't be difficult for the Russians to do in Estonia and Latvia exactly what they did in Ukraine and in Georgia, which is excite the Russian-speaking minorities to disorder and then bring in their troops dressed as something else, dressed as tourists, but they behave like troops.
The little green men.
The little green men, that's right. They don't wear uniforms. They all went to the Army and Navy store, but 5,000 of them all turned up on holiday, apparently, and behaved as a cohesive...
It's awful when you end up in the same outfit, isn't it?
It's awful.
Yeah.
And so they... And that's what they do, and they take it over. So there's a danger in Estonia and Latvia, and they're very well aware of that in those governments. Lithuania, not quite so vulnerable from a minorities point of view, but Lithuania is right next to Belarus, and there's the Kaliningrad enclave right next to Western Lithuania. The Lithuanians certainly feel that they could be vulnerable. And Putin has said in the past, he said that the Baltic states are part of Russia's natural empire, part of the empire of Peter the Great, and that he doesn't really recognize their sovereignty. He's not as rude about them as he is about Ukraine, which he says is a ridiculous country, it has no right to exist. He's not quite as rude about the Baltics, but certainly the idea of taking on the Baltics, or one of the Baltics, as a NATO state would be to test whether NATO really means it. If they were able to not roll over the border with tanks, but create a situation in one of the Baltic states which created a military response, and Europe didn't react very strongly, then the Russians would say to themselves, all this Article 5 stuff that NATO talks about, an attack on one is an attack on all, maybe it doesn't really exist.
Well, yeah, especially in the age of Trump 2.0. I mean, that's, again, a very good connection to the next question, which is from Barb. Barb, thank you for the question. Asking how long will the necessary military rebuild take Putin before his forces are a serious invasion threat to NATO? As you say, there are different ways to measure that. You know, what is an invasion? What is sort of people appearing or agitating? But in terms of that, if Putin did want that, you know, a serious fight with NATO, if there is Article 5, what sort of state are Russia's forces in to fight that, and how long would it take to get there?
Yeah, I mean, Russian forces are run down in the ground sector, so his army certainly needs 3 or 4 years to reconstitute itself to be a war-fighting organisation. But remember, his navy, I mean, the Black Sea Fleet has been very, very badly affected, but that's because it can't be reinforced. The Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet are still what they were. The Air Force is still largely what it was because the Russian Air Force hasn't fully committed itself to the Ukraine war. They've held back precisely because they fear Western air power, which is very strong, much stronger than Russian air power. And they didn't want to commit all of their air power to Ukraine in case they lost a lot of it, and it left them in a very bad position in relation to NATO. So the Russian Air Force is in pretty good shape. Russian nuclear forces are genuinely all modernized now and refurbished. So their nuclear forces, their strategic forces, their air force is pretty good, their navies, Northern Pacific fleets are pretty good. So they've lost a lot of their Black Sea Fleet, and their ground forces will take a bit of time before they could war fight. But the ground forces, even as they stand, if they stop fighting in Ukraine, are capable of doing things. They're capable of intervening. They could take Moldova for sure. That wouldn't take very much. I mean, a couple of corps, even 3 or 4 brigades or 2 divisions, whatever it might be, would be sufficient to do the sort of operations that we might regard as threatening.
And NATO's response, I mean, again, it all depends on America, doesn't it? But, you know, if you think about sort of the NATO troops in Europe, mainland Europe, how is there enough there to sort of repel that sort of force?
If they were mobilized properly, yes. I mean, there are, 90,000 American troops in Europe. About 4,500, 5,000 of them were sent by Joe Biden to the north, to Poland and the Baltic states, specifically against the sort of threats we've just been talking about. And there's some speculation now, of course, that Trump might withdraw some of these troops. They don't want so many of them in Europe, and that he might withdraw a fair few. But most analysts think they wouldn't withdraw completely. They would leave some. But if the Americans withdrew from the north, then that would leave Russia facing only European troops in the Baltic and Poland. And that might be very tempting for an expansionist Russia, which is on a roll at the moment. I mean, Putin feels that momentum is with him, and we'll see how he reacts to that. But NATO in Europe has got 2 million troops, but they can't get them anywhere. I mean, this is the stupid thing about NATO. They lack the transport. They lack the ability to move them around their own continent without American support. And over the years, European NATO has allowed itself to become so dependent on American enablers, as we call them, the enablers, the transport, the intelligence, the communications backup, the sophisticated stuff. The Americans provide it for everybody. Now, the Europeans have recognized this and they're doing something about it, but they should have been doing something about it 15 years ago, instead of which they started doing something about it last year. So we're a long way behind. With enough notice, European NATO would respond pretty well. But in a rapidly developing crisis, European NATO would struggle.
Michael, thank you. We're going to do, if it's all right with you, a quick fire round. Just got questions coming in. First one from Steve Seaman. Steve, thank you for that. Do you think Russia is prepared to cede any land that they have taken?
No. They want everything. What they've said, they want all the land that they've conquered, plus some that they haven't. So in other words, they say, we haven't fully taken Luhansk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia or Kherson. We've been thrown out of some of Kherson. We want it all. So we want you to give us all 4 of those oblasts, those regions. We've got the whole of Crimea. So we demand that we occupy now 5 of the regions of Ukraine, which will include some parts that they haven't conquered. So, yeah, they want more. And then they want some sweeteners as well on top of that, which is some control over what Ukraine can and can't do, what size army Ukrainians are allowed. They'll want elections in Ukraine, which they'll be able to interfere with, so that they can, if they hope, get a pro-Moscow puppet leader into power in Kyiv.
And Jack Crawford's asking, do you think there'll have to be physical barriers protecting the Ukraine border from Russia after the war ends? High concrete walls, anti-tank spikes, landmines, surveillance towers. What does that look like?
Not necessarily. You could, because this is a very long barrier, 1,000 kilometres along the border, it's probably more efficient to try to monitor it with remote means. Sensors, space-based satellite imagery, aircraft flying over, drones. You can look after a border remotely without having physical barriers, although the Ukrainians might want to have some pretty big minefields just behind their part of the border, because minefields, they don't stop anybody crossing them, but they certainly slow them down and give the defender a bit of time to organise themselves.
Thanks. We've got another couple here. So how safe can Chernobyl be made during negotiations? It's always been a cause of concern during this. And then Colin asking, Europe's just begun the long road to building up its defences against Russia. Realistically, is there enough time before Putin attacks NATO?
Yeah, well, on Chernobyl and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant are both vulnerable. They're both in Russian hands. And depending on how a peace deal would work out, one of the details, an important detail of a peace deal, will be to get Ukrainian technicians back into those plants, even if they're Russian controlled, in order to make them safe. Nobody is happy about the safety of either of those places. Chernobyl, of course, is closed down, but it's very toxic, the whole site. And the Zaporizhia power plant's got 6 reactors. They're all closed down, but they have to be maintained properly, or you get another Chernobyl. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is very worried about the state of the Zaporizhia plant. So that's got to be dealt with in some sort of peace deal. And sorry, the second bit of that question?
Europe and what we're hearing today about UK increasing its defence spending.
Oh, yeah.
Is there enough time? Have we left it too late to build up forces?
Well, it depends on the scenarios, but everyone assumes that Europe has got to be capable of much more vigorous defence within 2 to 3 years from now. And I think there is a sort of a deadline here, because while Trump is in the White House, so 4 years, and then maybe, of course, there may be a Trumpist candidate afterwards, so this might be 12 years of MAGA politics, because quite possibly Trump will lay the groundwork for somebody else to take over after him who'll do 2 terms. So this might be a 12-year process, but it's in any case going to be a 4-year process. And the Kremlin knows that in this next 4 years, it has an opportunity to further its aims in Europe, and America, on present trends, looks as if it won't intervene, won't worry too much about it. And so that means that between now and, let's say, 2028, 29, the Russians will be much more encouraged to make the most of what they now see as their opportunities. Opportunities, I have to say, they couldn't have dreamed of 6 months ago, fallen into their lap.
Yeah, and there was always this sense they were waiting for this, but just way beyond their wildest imagination.
The 2 leaders in the world who were most waiting for a Trump victory was Putin and Netanyahu in Israel.
Yeah.
Because in both cases, they feel this man gives us permission to do what we want.
They can't believe their luck, can they? There's a question from Richard, which is a good question, thinking about the origins of this war, at least from Russia's point of view. If Russia doesn't want NATO on its doorstep, then why is it trying to take Ukraine? As soon as it does take Ukraine, then you've got NATO on its doorstep.
And that's one of the great conundrums of this, that, as people said, Boris Johnson always made the point. He said, Mr. Putin, you said you wanted less NATO. Now you've got more NATO anyway, because as a result of your aggression, Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. I mean, Finland had been neutral since 1945. Sweden had been neutral since 1812. And within months of the Russian aggression, they applied for NATO membership. And now they're members of NATO. So NATO is now an alliance of 32 nations. It's now, NATO is 1,000 miles closer to Moscow than where it was at the end of the Cold War. And that's what worries Putin, because he sees the world in terms, like Trump, he sees the world in terms of geography. He sees the amount of land which Russia occupies, and he worries that if the land beyond Russia is not a buffer zone, he wants weak states on his border. Doesn't want strong states, democratic states, not interested in that. He wants a border with weak states which are buffers between him and us, because he fears us so much, not because he thinks that we are going to attack him. He fears not what we do, he fears what we are. Mm-hmm. He fears what we are. We are democracies, and he thinks that we're democracies all run by a bunch of gays and lesbians and degenerates. And so he fears what we are, not what we do.
Well, that's some of the appeal for the MAGA crowd as well, isn't it, in terms of the admiration they have for Putin. Speaking of what he might do with Europe, if the US is no longer Europe's security guarantee, this is Marlon asking this, how vulnerable is Europe to being bullied by a nefarious nuclear power such as Russia? Is Europe's nuclear capability, which is obviously just the UK and France, is that a deterrent?
It is. The French nuclear deterrent, in theory, is only for France. The French have always said we only use it for our own purposes. It doesn't cover anybody else. Britain's nuclear deterrent has always been devoted to NATO. We said as a last resort we'd use it for our own purposes because we control it. But we used to fit into what was called the SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan, which the Americans had, and the SIOP doesn't exist anymore. But we still devote all of our weapons, in theory, to NATO. And in the old days, British nuclear weapons were always assumed to be targeted on troop concentrations in Eastern Europe in the old days of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Our weapons are now detargeted, said to be detargeted. They don't point to anything specific. But undoubtedly, British nuclear weapons do cover whatever we think are useful targets for all of our NATO allies. So, in a way, British and French nuclear weapons already do cover our NATO allies, but that could be made more explicit. You could beef it up by we could go back to having air-delivered weapons. I mean, all of our nuclear weapons are delivered by submarines, by the missiles fired by our submarines. One submarine is out at any given moment, only one. But that one submarine, somewhere in the North Atlantic, can deliver 40 warheads. 40, that's quite a lot. And we could supplement that by saying, OK, we'll go back to air-delivered. Typhoon or F-35 aircraft could be nuclear capable. So we could have a couple of squadrons of those who can deliver weapons. And they could be forward-based. So you could base them in Germany or Poland or whatever else. There are different ways you could do it to beef it up. But it more or less already exists, to be honest.
There's, on the submarine, I was reading the other day, a slight aside, that the only prime minister not to have their orders put on a submarine, the ones you open in case of emergency or the end of the world, was Liz Truss, because she didn't have enough time in number 10 to do it.
Yeah, they're said to have to write the letter within the first 24 hours. It's the first thing that they do. They write the letter, which is the letter of last resort, which goes into a locked safe on board the submarine that's out at any given time. And why she didn't write it in the 41, 43 days she was there, or she wrote it and it didn't get put on the submarine, possibly.
Blame the post.
It could have. Well, in a way, the submarines are out for 3 months at a time.
Oh, yeah.
So probably the letter was written and it was waiting to go at the next patrol. But she was gone before the next patrol was due to go out.
We'll just get a few more before we run out of time, although I can keep going. But a couple here about Ukraine, which we slightly touched on, but Matt asking basically, does Ukraine have to agree to a US-Russia deal? Could they just keep going despite what the US agrees? And that's also echoed by Stepwise saying, could Europe provide sufficient support for Ukraine to fight back against Russia without the US? If this deal is made, if Zelensky is not at the table, which doesn't sound like it will be now despite initial fears, could Ukraine just ignore it?
They could. And that's, as we were saying before, I mean, Ukrainians could carry on fighting with what they've got and what they will get from Europe. I mean, to what strategic purpose, is a question. But if some really hopeless deal is forced on them, which is full of these Russian sweeteners, which really reduces their ability to operate as as a sovereign state. It has no guarantees at all and leaves the Russians in a position to just decide when to mount the next assault on Ukraine. If they were faced with that, then they might say, well, why should we sign our own death warrant? It's very hard to negotiate with somebody who's trying to kill you. So we'll just keep on fighting. So it is plausible that they could keep on going. And at some point, Ukraine's got to be brought into this and persuaded that this is the best offer.
Yeah, and in terms of that offer and what Ukraine has to give up, a lot of focus today and over the last week over this minerals deal. And we've got a couple of questions on that. First from Christopheros, who says, is all this hot air and wrangling about very little more than getting hands on minerals? And was the Falklands War about uranium and both Gulf Wars about oil just the very same? Is, very realpolitik view of the world from Christopheros there. No. And then also just quickly from LMG, what is Ukraine getting out of this deal? That's the minerals deal. They're not guaranteed US protection, European peacekeepers, or seemingly any more support. Is this purely dividends for the Trump team to take back home?
Yeah, on that second part, it is. I mean, there's a lot of miscommunication, I think, about these rare earths and Ukrainian minerals. First of all, they're not that rare. There's not so many of them. And in a country as big as Ukraine, so it's Europe's biggest landmass in a single country, apart from Russia itself, you would expect there to be quite a lot of minerals. And there's oil and there's gas, there's coal, and then there's quite a lot of minerals. I mean, tritium and lithium. And then there's some of the rare earths, like scandium. But not more rare earths than you'd expect anywhere else. The point about the deal, and I think Zelensky missold it to the Americans, thinking that they would take a different view of Ukraine if he said, look at all these minerals we've got. He didn't realize he was dealing with such a predatory leadership who simply said, oh, well, we want 500 million of them. We want 500 billion of them. In payment for the 100, we've given you 100 billion, we want 500 billion back in return. That's like an interest rate of 400%. I mean, I think he couldn't believe how predatory they were. But they've now come back with a different offer. And what this mineral arrangement is to say, look, we're not really sure how much these minerals are worth. We're not even sure we know where they are. We're not sure how good these deposits are, because these estimates are all drawn up in the Soviet era, and they were extremely inaccurate then. But as we develop them, we'll develop them together. We'll give the United States a pretty privileged position in helping the development. And that's, although there's no security guarantee that goes with it explicitly, it's an implicit security guarantee. So it's in America's interests to help the Ukrainian economy develop, partly on the basis of exploiting the minerals, which are bound to be there in such a big country. But you can bet your life, the minerals which will turn out to be most valuable will be oil and gas and coal. Not very rare.
Yeah, and as you're saying, the comparisons with the Gulf War, their suspicions might linger for a while to come. I suppose, and that's a good note to end on with this last question, which is from the Howard family in Cheshire. Thanks for sending that in. Asking you, if you had to predict the future, where would you say this all goes in year to come? I have a feeling a deal with Putin is going to go down in history as a terrible mistake.
Yes, I mean, sadly, I think we're on the edge of a historic betrayal of historic proportions because, as I say, I mean, it looks as if Ukraine is going to lose close to 20% of its territory, and the Western world is going to lose close to 100% of its political credibility. The Western world as a construct, I think, is dead. International law as the universal construct is dead. It's gone. Not just this last couple of weeks. It's been sliding fast in the last 3 or 4 years, but this last couple of weeks has put the final nails in a number of coffins. And the world we're now in is a world of new imperialism. So we've got 3 great autocrats in the world now: Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump. And these 3 autocrats are all imperialists. They all want to enlarge their countries. So Putin has made it very clear where he wants to enlarge his country. He wants to get the old Soviet Union back in some form. Xi Jinping has made it very clear he wants to enlarge his country into Taiwan and the South China Sea and the possessions of Southeast Asia. And Donald Trump is determined to enlarge his country. He's serious about taking Greenland. He's pretty serious about Panama. He's serious about putting pressure on Canada to change the status. I don't think he'll succeed in that. But he's really serious about Greenland. He wants to go down as one of the presidents, like President Mackinder, who actually made America physically bigger. And he wants his statue on Mount Rushmore. And his vision as one of the 3 great autocrats is that the 3 autocrats will come together in some grand conference in 18 months or 2 years' time, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Trump, and they will settle the world They'll do a big, big deal because what he cares about is trade, making America's economy dominant, and enlarging the physical side of America. And if in this great sit down that he has with the three great autocrats, he can rebalance the world economy, he can do something to reduce the nuclear presence in the world, to nuclear weapons between the three of them.
He's quite keen on that, isn't he?
He is. He's been very clear that's what he wants to achieve. And his presidency is all about him. He wants that you'll get the Nobel Peace Prize and a statue on Mount Rushmore, and he will then leave office as a very happy man. That's what he really wants. And for that, he doesn't care about Ukraine, just wants it out of the way. He doesn't care about the Palestinians and Gaza, just wants them out of the way. Doesn't care about Taiwan, wants that out of the way. Doesn't care about NATO, wants that all out of the way. He wants the things that matter to him in relation to Putin and Xi Jinping, the three great autocrats who will reorder the world sometime in the next 4 years. So we're living in very, very dark days, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I suppose that they are the only leaders he really sees even approaching the same level as him when it comes to everyone else who's going to Washington, including our Prime Minister this week.
Yes.
Michael Clarke, thank you so much for answering those questions. Thank you all for sending in those questions. It's been really, really interesting. We'll see you next time.